It is one thing, on a frontier vast enough to feel like a small country, to hunt a stranger across its hard miles and open distances. That was not just colorful talk or the stuff of dime novel fiction. It was the plain and often punishing truth of how law enforcement actually worked. A deputy United States marshal might be charged with enormous stretches of land, sparse infrastructure, and long reaches of country where a badge didn't arrive with backup so much as it arrived with a horse, a rifle, and a great deal of patience and luck. Welcome to Insights into History, Season 2, Episode 2, The Badge's Most Brutal Assignment. In the early summer of 1902, Bass Reeves, by then a veteran deputy United States Marshal with a formidable reputation, faced a case that collapsed the distance between public duty and private life. According to the National Park Service and the 11 National Archives, Reeves's son Benjamin, known as Benny, killed his wife, Costella Brown, in Muskogee on June 7, 1902. And Bass Reeves was ultimately the man who served the warrant that brought his son in. The pattern of facts is reinforced by additional federal record context. A National Archives blog post, drawing on Benny Reeves's inmate case file, places the killing in the early afternoon of June 7, 1902, and follows the case into its grim administrative afterlife, mugshots, incarceration. A human life reduced, at last, to paperwork and prison numbers. So it was that the central claim holds. Reeves arrested his own son for murder. But here again, the story tightens into something more intimate and more terrible. It's not a tale about shooting a fugitive or out-tracking a gang. It is a story of law as a mirror held so close that a man can no longer pretend he doesn't recognize the face looking back at him. Not only because the law required it, but because Reeves did not treat family as an exemption from duty. Reeves believed the badge meant something, even when the law did not always mean fairness for him. It is there that the legend stops feeling like a campfire tale and becomes something heavier. The heaviness lies in what the story refuses to do. It doesn't permit the badge to become part of a costume, nor does it allow the frontier to become theater. This excerpt from history insists that duty carries consequences, and that sometimes the consequence is carrying your own grief into the saddle. It also places Reeves within the harder truth beneath so much American mythmaking, a formerly enslaved man enforcing federal law in a region shaped by violent change, where the promises of Reconstruction collided with the bitter backlash that followed. That is why the image endures. Not because it's dramatic, even though it is, but because it's clean. A warrant, a name, a decision. You don't get much cleaner than that. But clean doesn't actually mean easy by any stretch of the imagination. Bass Reeves comes down to us in a kind of double exposure, respected and slandered, celebrated and doubted. That tension isn't just a matter of opinion. It's built into the very way his life was recorded. Reeves is remembered as a formidable federal lawman, and yet the public trail that preserves him is uneven, scattered, and often shaped by the priorities and blind spots of the age that watched him work. For historians, Reeves isn't the sort of man one reconstructs from a neat archive box marked the life of Bass Reeves. It's not nearly that cut and dry despite what the legend might suggest. More often, one finds him the way one finds frontier history itself, sideways, indirectly, in documents created for entirely different reasons. One of the chief backbones of that reconstruction is the federal court record system connected to Fort Smith, Arkansas, whose court held unusual reach into Indian Territory for many criminal matters. The National Archives research guidance for the Fort Smith criminal case files makes clear that the court's jurisdiction extended beyond Arkansas into Indian Territory, and that those records cover a vast region and a heavy volume of criminal cases. Those case files, dockets, and related papers were not created to celebrate anyone. They were created to process arrests, prosecutions, testimony, sentencing, and appeals. In other words, they are the sort of evidence that survives precisely because it was bureaucratic and routine. The frontier, for all its romance, was still fond of paperwork. Even legend, it turns out, had to stand in line at a clerk's window. But bureaucracy has limits of its own. Court records can tell us something happened, an indictment was filed, a defendant named, a marshal assigned, a warrant issued, a prisoner delivered, all without always preserving the human drama of how it unfolded across rivers, scrubland, and miles of hard weather. As a result, Reeves's biography must be stitched together from several fabrics: court filings for structure, newsprint for color, and later reconstruction to connect what the original record leaves unconnected. Newspapers were where frontier lives so often became stories. But newspapers were also where frontier lives were simplified, sensationalized, and selectively credited. Some incidents were reported incompletely. Others were exaggerated. Others omitted the most important detail of all: the name of the man who actually did the work. The National Park Service says this plainly. Truthful accounts of Reeves's arrests and shootouts were rarely published, and his role was sometimes omitted or credited to someone else. That's a critical detail, not because it flatters Reeves, but because it reveals the mechanics of forgetting. When a person's name goes missing again and again from contemporary reporting, later generations inherit a story with the identifying label torn away. So the phrase "celebrated and doubted" is not only about reputation. It is about documentation. When source material is patchy, the empty spaces don't remain empty for very long. They get filled quickly and inaccurately. Sometimes by careful inference or wishful mythmaking. Sometimes by a cultural template that decides what a real frontier hero is supposed to look like, and then edits the past until it fits. Reeves's story stands at the crossroads of two powerful forces: a scattered archival footprint, the sort that forces historians to triangulate from case files, newspaper clippings, and later accounts, and a popular genre. The classic Western narrative engine, which long preferred to produce a clean, repeatable hero image rather than portray the West as it actually was: violent, chaotic, and dangerous. Where the paperwork thins, later storytelling tends to swell. Numbers are rounded, incidents are sharpened into parables, and contradictions are sanded smooth. One eventually arrives at a figure who can be at once famous and unknown. Famous as an idea, unknown in the ways that matter most to historians. That leads to the uncomfortable truth behind Reeves's long absence from the mainstream Western pantheon. It wasn't just an accident of obscurity. It was also the product of a frame that treated whiteness as the default protagonist and relegated everyone else to scenery, sidekick, or exception. Modern historical and cultural reassessments increasingly name that erasure directly in discussions of Reeves and in the broader reconsideration of Black presence in the West and in Western storytelling. Reeves's reemergence is part of that larger correction, not the sudden discovery of a hidden man, but the recognition that the record contained him all along, just not always in the places popular mythology taught people to look. That is the central tension of Bass Reeves. His life was real, the work was documented, but the story was filtered. Not erased altogether, but thinned, redirected, delayed. The result is a legacy rebuilt from fragments, with each new piece of evidence carrying two weights at once: what it says about Reeves, and what it reveals about the culture that once found it so easy to leave him out of the picture. Bass Reeves. Even the name sounds like a headline: clean, blunt, difficult to forget. Deputy United States Marshal. Federal Peace Officer. Those titles are accurate. Reeves served as a Deputy United States Marshal for decades, working chiefly in what was then called Indian Territory, an immense jurisdiction where federal authority depended on a small number of deputies willing to ride long distances, serve warrants, and return fugitives to court. He is also widely described as one of the earliest Black Deputy United States Marshals operating west of the Mississippi, a claim supported by strong reference works, which agree that he was among the first African-descended deputy marshals in the American West. Some sources do indeed call him the first. But the documentation necessary to establish a single, unambiguous first is not presented consistently across reliable historical summaries, and so that claim is best treated as possible, but not settled. Like so many legends of that era, Reeves's birth is disputed. That's not just literary flourish. It's the real difficulty of reconstructing the early life of a man born into slavery, when record-keeping could be inconsistent, incomplete, or filtered through later retellings. Many modern references place his birth in July 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, though some historical treatments offer a different date and place. The safest summary is that Reeves was born enslaved in the late 1830s, and that the precise details of his birth remain contested. These differing accounts don't necessarily cancel one another. Biographical facts for enslaved people were often recorded late, secondhand, or not at all. What matters is the honest conclusion. Reeves's early life specifics remain in dispute, even as the broad arc of his later career is much better documented. The date most major references give for Reeves's death is January 12, 1910, in Muskogee, Oklahoma. This is one of the firm anchors in his timeline, consistently corroborated across major references. He's remembered for decades of federal law work in Indian Territory and for extraordinary tracking skills, a reputation that appears again and again in historical summaries of his service. Then there is the famous number, more than 3,000 arrests. That figure appears in historical reporting and in Reeves's own later recollections, but the National Park Service cautions that the surviving record is incomplete and exaggerated, and so the number is best treated as an estimate, not an audited total. Britannica, for example, notes that he apprehended more than 3,000, according to contemporary reports, signaling both the scale and the source of the claim. The National Park Service goes further, warning that the record is incomplete and exaggerated, and explicitly connecting the spread of the 3,000 arrest figure. Along with varying counts of outlaws killed to the uneven way Reeves's career was reported, or not reported, at the time. To treat over 3,000 as an estimate is not caution carried to timid excess. It's the responsible way to handle a number that reaches us through interviews, newspapers, and retellings, especially when even the most careful historians acknowledge gaps and distortions in the surviving narrative. The paper trail is scattered. Research on Reeves leans heavily on federal court documentation and contemporary press accounts that are unevenly preserved, unevenly detailed, and unevenly indexed. The final point is the one that explains the silence most sharply. The classic Western story was curated, and at times aggressively so, to center white heroes and flatten everyone else into background noise. The National Park Service makes a closely related claim in concrete terms. Truthful accounts of Reeves's arrests and shootouts were rarely published. His name was often omitted, and credit could be redirected elsewhere. Conditions that almost mechanically explain how a major figure can become a minor footnote in popular memory. In other words, the puzzle is not why a lawman like Reeves became legendary. The puzzle is why his legend had to be rebuilt later, from fragments, cautions, and corrections, instead of being handed down cleanly by the very era that watched him work. Bass Reeves was anything but background noise. Reeves entered the world enslaved. On that point, the record remains steady across the most reliable summaries. However the details may shift, his starting condition was bondage, and everything that follows, escape, survival, service, must all be understood through that reality. What remains less certain is the exact marker that signals his beginning on the map. Some accounts anchor his birth and earliest years in Arkansas, tied to the Reeves family and the slaveholding network that later extended into Texas. A substantial complication comes from a detailed 1990 Chronicles of Oklahoma article, United States vs. Bass Reeves, Black Lawman on Trial, which places his birth instead near Paris, Lamar County, Texas, in July 1840, and states that he was chosen as a youngster to be the companion of his master's son. Those versions cannot both be completely correct in every detail. That doesn't mean one is malicious. It means that the early life documentation of an enslaved person may be thin, secondhand, and compiled long after the fact. The safest approach is to rest on the ground toward which both streams of evidence point. Reeves was born into slavery, spent his formative years within Arkansas-Texas slaveholding networks, and eventually escaped into Indian Territory during the Civil War era. Indian Territory is where many American myths go to die, or to acquire a dangerous upgrade. For Bass Reeves, it was the upgrade, though not the tidy cinematic kind. No polished training montage or neat and gleaming origin story. What the most credible summaries agree upon is the broad outline. He fled enslavement during the Civil War period and lived for years in Indian Territory, what is roughly present-day Oklahoma, becoming deeply familiar with its terrain and its people. That mattered because in Indian Territory, the map was often the least useful thing a man could carry. The truly useful tool was lived knowledge, how long a creek remained passable after a storm, what a ridgeline concealed, where a settlement's patience began and ended. In that environment, a wrong assumption didn't just make a man late. It could make him lost, dead, or visible to the wrong people. The 1990 Chronicles of Oklahoma article makes the connection between those years and Reeves's later effectiveness explicit. It states that while in Indian Territory, he perfected his skills with firearms and developed instincts as a hunter and tracker, and that he also became familiar with several Native American languages, including Creek. It then says plainly, these skills made him the ideal recruit for service as a deputy marshal. That wasn't just a decorative detail. In a region where relationships could be as dangerous as ravines, language and custom were not social niceties. They were safety equipment. Because tracking is not merely following footprints. Tracking is reading a living system, broken grass, shifting weather, elapsed time, human habits, and what a fugitive is trying to hide. Indian Territory demanded that kind of reading, and it demanded it with consequences attached. It wasn't only the land that made Reeves valuable. The Chronicles of Oklahoma account frames his later recruitment partly in terms of access and acceptance in a multi-community environment. It describes the early federal court response out of Fort Smith to the widespread violence across the territory, white outlaws terrorizing interior tribes, and notes that whites, with or without badges, were unwelcome. Reeves, former Texas slave and fugitive in Indian country, was recruited because of his knowledge of the tribal languages, the territory, and its people, and the article states without euphemism that he was also recruited because he was black. That single paragraph reveals a great deal about how law actually functioned there. It wasn't simply that the law arrived and order obediently lined up. In fact, that was rarely the case. More often than not, the presence of federal authority only empowered local criminal networks to step up activity, almost as a territorial conflict. Indian Territory held multiple communities with long memories, multiple jurisdictions and loyalties, and a steady current of opportunistic violence. In such a place, an outsider lawman could easily appear as just another armed stranger carrying paperwork and a gun. Reeves's effectiveness depended on local knowledge of people, terrain, and language in a region that even contemporary observers described as unusually dangerous for deputy marshals. The same article underscores why the danger was structural, not incidental. Deputy marshals were paid on a fee system and could expect violence when making arrests. Resisting arrest carried penalties. As a result, outlaws often preferred a gunfight to facing Judge Isaac C. Parker's court at Fort Smith, which had a reputation for frequent death sentences. This was not a setting that rewarded naivete or theatrical swagger. It rewarded competence, patience, and the kind of situational clarity that can keep an arrest from becoming a funeral. A number of popular retellings say Reeves served with Union-aligned Indian units, often described as Union Indian Brigades or the Indian Home Guard. Some reputable regional summaries describe this as something believed to be true, rather than proven beyond doubt. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas, for example, says Reeves is believed to have served with Union Indian forces in Indian Territory during the Civil War. The Encyclopedia of Oklahoma History and Culture likewise frames Home Guard service as a belief, not a settled fact. That wording matters. It's plausible and fits the broader outline of his Civil War-era presence in Indian Territory. But it's not presented with the same documentary firmness as the core claims that he escaped into Indian Territory, lived there for years, learned languages and tracking, and was later recruited as a deputy marshal in part because of those skills and that identity, all of which made him viable in places where white lawmen were unwelcome. Reeves's Indian Territory years are not some mythic fog. They're the crucible that later sources, especially the strongest among them, used to explain his effectiveness. The uncertainties are real, but they don't erase the bottom line. They sharpen it. Reeves was born enslaved. He survived long enough to escape. He learned a hard place well enough to move through it. When federal authority needed someone who could operate where badges alone did not confer legitimacy, Reeves was not background noise. He was strategy. That's the bottom line. Reconstruction and its backlash were not abstractions for Reeves. They were the very air he breathed. When the Civil War ended, the United States didn't suddenly become settled. It became reorganized and, in many places, newly volatile. Federal authority in the West depended on men willing to carry warrants across distances that swallowed weeks, moving through communities with their own legal systems and powerful reasons to distrust outsiders. Fort Smith, Arkansas, situated on the eastern edge of Indian Territory, became a key federal hub for that work, with the United States District Court for Western Arkansas exercising jurisdiction over crimes connected to Indian Territory in this period. Indian Territory in the late 19th century was not a place, it was a complicated legal mosaic. The National Park Service notes that the territory was originally the domain of the 5 tribes, which included the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, each with their own governments, courts, and police. However, that local authority had limits. Tribal systems could not arrest white or black people who were not tribal citizens, and federal deputies were responsible for those arrests, as well as for cases in which native suspects committed crimes against non-native victims. That detail matters because it explains why federal policing there was at once necessary and incendiary. The deputy marshal was not merely enforcing law. He was operating at the seam where jurisdictions did not overlap neatly and legitimacy could be contested, where every arrest risked being understood as something more than an arrest. Federal policing in Indian Territory was unusually dangerous, and the National Park Service does not present that as folklore. By the late 19th century, Indian Territory had a reputation as the most dangerous region in the Old West for federal peace officers, with more than 120 deputy marshals reportedly killed there before statehood. This wasn't frontier drama. It was an attrition rate. It's in that context that Reeves's role becomes more than a tale of toughness. One of the most revealing details in the National Park Service's Fort Smith material is also one of the hardest to sit with. African-American deputy United States Marshals in Indian Territory had the authority to arrest whites, blacks, or Indians who broke federal law. A reality the National Park Service describes as very unique for black men living under the shadow of Jim Crow after Reconstruction ended in 1877. That arrangement did not merely complicate life. It weaponized visibility. A black deputy exercising federal authority over white suspects, and doing so in a region already thick with outlaw violence and legal friction, wasn't simply performing a job. He was inhabiting a contradiction the era often could not bear to see. The badge could make a man powerful in theory while making him a target in practice. That is why Reeves can't be reduced to a tough man with a gun. Plenty of tough men carried guns. Reeves worked inside a legal minefield, where authority depended upon paper that might not protect him, and where resentment could be every bit as lethal as any fugitive. After the war, the public record doesn't spring at once into sharp focus. That's not because Reeves's life became quiet. It's because the next kind of work he did was the kind that rarely receives a byline, especially when the man doing it didn't fit the period's preferred silhouette of a hero. Multiple reputable summaries describe Reeves settling in Van Buren, Arkansas, after the Civil War, building a post-war life as a farmer and stockman. On the surface, it appears almost ordinary: land, livestock, family, routine. A look at the geography adds necessary detail to this aspect of his life. Van Buren sits on the Arkansas River across from Fort Smith, close to the federal court infrastructure that mattered, and close to the borderland where enforcement became complex, contested, and dangerous. That geography matters because it places Reeves at the edge of the jurisdiction that would soon shape his life. Then comes the hinge in the story. Oral history and later summaries describe Reeves serving as a scout and guide for Deputy United States Marshals going into Indian Territory on business connected to the federal court. This was a classic example of knowledge work disguised as labor. A guide is not merely someone who knows the way. A guide knows where the route stops being reliable, where roads become guesses. Guides of the time know where the wrong creek crossing costs a day and where local rules matter more than federal assumptions. In a region defined by overlapping authority and lethal unpredictability, that kind of knowledge was not decoration. It was leverage. Reeves didn't become valuable to federal law simply because he was fearless. He became valuable because he was useful in the precise manner that borderlands demand. Knowledge, experience, bravery, and reliability all added to Reeves' value and effectiveness. Indian Territory forced a person to learn a living system, terrain, weather, time, human habits, and what people try to hide. The National Park Service describes the region as a complex jurisdictional environment and stresses that it was extraordinarily dangerous for federal peace officers, dangerous enough that Indian Territory and the later Oklahoma Territory were, by the late 1800s, the most dangerous places in the Old West for federal officers, with more than 120 killed before Oklahoma statehood, as mentioned previously. In a landscape like that, a guide was not a convenience, they were risk management. In essence, Reeves became a human map. Not the cute, tourist kind with tidy labels and no mud on their boots. He was a working map. A living chain of local knowledge, where water ran after a storm, where ground turned to muck, how far a horse could be pressed without ruining the whole plan, which route allowed a deputy to arrive unseen, and which route guaranteed he would be seen by exactly the wrong people. There was another layer to this that's easy to miss if the story is told only as one of wilderness skills. Guiding was the equivalent of social engineering of the day. Indian Territory wasn't just empty space, far from it. It was communities, nations, kin networks, and long memories shaped by removal, violence, and constant pressure from outsiders. The National Park Service notes that multiple tribal governments and law enforcement systems operated there, and that jurisdictional limits meant federal marshals were often responsible for arrests tribal authorities couldn't legally make, including arrests of many non-tribal citizens. In that world, a lawman's social footprint could be as dangerous as his physical one. The wrong entrance, the wrong assumption, the wrong conversation with the wrong person, all of these could ruin a mission long before anyone ever laid eyes on the fugitive. That's where Reeves's background became professionally relevant, not merely biographically dramatic. Some authoritative summaries emphasize that whites, badge or no badge, could be unwelcome in parts of the territory, and that Reeves's knowledge of the people and the region made him valuable to federal enforcement efforts. A black guide who already knew the terrain and local dynamics might, in some places, enter without automatically becoming the problem in the same way a white outsider could. Not necessarily safe, certainly not immune, but able to move with greater awareness and the ability to help others do the same. That distinction, awareness rather than safety, is precisely what made the role so important. Before Reeves became known for bringing people in, he was more valuable for getting people out of the territory in one piece after they got in. That's the bridge between the post-war Reeves and the Reeves later associated with federal court enforcement out of Fort Smith in the mid-1870s. Reference works consistently place him near Van Buren after the Civil War and describe him guiding marshals into the territory before he was commissioned as a deputy. His work as a deputy United States Marshal was a natural extension of his scouting activities. In 1875, Reeves is approached, recruited, and becomes a commissioned deputy United States Marshal serving the Western District of Arkansas, which had responsibility connected to Indian Territory and the area closely tied to the Fort Smith federal court system. That Guide Scout phase makes his experience feel like an actual career, rather than a legend dropped from the sky. It reframes the hero story into something far more believable and far more useful. Not magic, but apprenticeship. A man building a skill set in plain sight which was diverse and function, which included farming, stock work, guiding, until the federal government found itself in need of exactly what he had already become, someone who could read a landscape like a document, and read danger the way other men read weather. Then came 1875, the year the Fort Smith court system shifted from important to overwhelming. Judge Isaac C. Parker took the bench at the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in 1875, presiding over the United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas, whose jurisdiction extended into Indian Territory for many criminal matters. That detail wasn't administrative clutter. It defined the operating reality. Fort Smith became the pipeline through which federal warrants flowed into a region that could be immense, fragmented, and violently resistant to outside enforcement. The court's reach demanded a large field force composed of deputy marshals willing to ride far, track hard, and return prisoners to Fort Smith to face federal process. Within that system, Bass Reeves was commissioned as a deputy United States Marshal. That commissioning reframes the myth. Reeves doesn't stride onto the stage as a fully formed legend. He's drawn into an institutional machine that is expanding quickly, operating under pressure, and in constant need of men capable of surviving the work. The 1990 Chronicles of Oklahoma article is unusually direct about why Reeves stood out as a recruit. It describes him as valuable not only for his knowledge of the territory and his ability to move across communities, but also, bluntly, because being black could make him more acceptable, or at the very least less immediately provocative in places where white lawmen were unwelcome. That's an unromantic but essential point. On the frontier, authority was not always granted by a badge. It was negotiated, sometimes silently, other times at gunpoint. It could also be earned through local history, reputation, and resentment. Reeves was valuable because he could go where others could not, and because he could do the job where others might not survive it. Deputy marshals were frequently paid through a fee system, which might not always be a profitable pursuit for the deputies. At Fort Smith, the National Park Service lays out the mechanics clearly. Until late in the 19th century, deputies were compensated largely by set fees for tasks such as serving documents, making arrests, and by mileage. An arrest earned $2, or about $60 today. Mileage could be 6 cents per mile outbound or around $2.10 per mile, which translates to about $3 today for the deputy, and often the prisoner on the return to Fort Smith. Deputies had to document their actions and their miles in order to be paid. The structure of incentives was stark. If a deputy failed to make the arrest regardless how much time, money, or horseflesh he had spent, he received no payment. That's why the job created constant motion and risk. It didn't reward patrol. It rewarded results. The fee system also shaped how violence was handled. It's easy, in later storytelling, to discuss a lawman's body count as though it were a scoreboard. But the Fort Smith system didn't treat killings as casual paperwork. The National Park Service notes that if a deputy killed a suspect while attempting an arrest, he could find himself bearing costs himself. Those costs might include burying the deceased at his own expense, unless of course relatives or friends could be found. The resulting compensation in that circumstance could shrink to $1 for the time and money spent attempting the arrest. That doesn't mean deputies avoided violence. It means violence carried legal scrutiny, financial downside, and reputational hazard. A deputy's use of force could echo backward into court, outward into the community, and forward into his ability to continue working. In a place where rumor traveled quickly and distrust faster still, a shooting could haunt a man long after the dust had settled. When we refer to a lawman's violence in that era, we're not speaking of a video game tally or a row of marks carved into a saloon wall. We're referring to the collision of danger, documentation, money, and legitimacy. All of this in a region already notorious for killing federal officers. Reeves is often credited with arresting over 3,000 people. That number isn't a modern invention. It's got a historical paper trail. The Fort Smith National Historic Site page states that in a 1901 interview with a territorial newspaper, Reeves said he had arrested over 3,000 men and women for violating federal law in Indian Territory. The same page also says he was involved in numerous shootouts and was never wounded. But that is only one side of the record. The 1990 Chronicles of Oklahoma article urges caution, describing Reeves's capture totals in broader terms. The Chronicles instead suggest hundreds, warning that many stories about him are questionable, a reminder that legend and record can, over time, braid together until the seam becomes difficult to see. Taken together, the most responsible conclusion is that Reeves was a high-performing, long-serving deputy. Multiple sources repeat extraordinarily high arrest totals, but precise career statistics should be treated as estimates, not audited spreadsheets. What is clear is the shape of his career. Fort Smith needed deputies who could operate at the far edge of federal reach, and Reeves met that need with unusual efficiency. Being part tracker, part diplomat, part enforcement engine, he was ideally suited to working inside a system that paid by outcomes, punished failure, and never promised survival. The frontier was a place where performance management looked less like a supervisor studying a chart and more like a tired deputy counting warrants by lantern light. There was no quarterly scorecard for arrests completed or risk exposure. There was weather, distance, bad information, worse roads, and the hard rule that if a man hesitated at the wrong moment, he did not get a second chance. That was the world Bass Reeves inhabited. Federal authority stretched thin across Indian Territory. Deputies were expected to execute warrants far from help and return with prisoners to face federal court. It was also a world in which the very things we most wish to count, such as arrests, shootouts, and killings, rarely behave like clean data because they pass through rumor, headlines, and retelling before they ever reach a historian's desk. That's what makes his record on killings so revealing. It's one of the few numbers Reeves himself left behind, and even that number soon turned into folklore. One often repeated figure holds that Reeves said he had killed 14 men in self-defense. Later newspapers inflated the number to more than 20. Those figures belong to the historical record of how Reeves was described, but they shouldn't be treated as precise modern statistics. That, in miniature, is the Frontier Information System. A blunt self-report of 14 killed in self-defense. A headline-friendly escalation to over 20 and a legacy number that becomes shorthand for a man's whole moral character. Once a number becomes shorthand, it stops being merely a statistic. It becomes a story people can point at. The Chronicles of Oklahoma article, often cited for deeper context, treats the legend with greater caution, emphasizing that the record and the folklore are tangled, and that many dramatic stories circulating about Reeves are questionable. It's also worth noting that Reeves's use of force did not occur in a vacuum. Deputies who killed in the line of duty could still face scrutiny, legal, financial, and reputational. In at least one well-documented courtroom episode regarding the accidental shooting of Reeves's cook William Leach, Reeves stood trial and was acquitted. However, the case shows how quickly violence, accidental or intentional, could become a legal and public crisis for a deputy marshal. Even when a courtroom stamped something justified, the wider public did not have to honor the stamp. Public opinion was not bound by rules of evidence. It could take the drama and discard the nuance. In places where people already feared federal power, feared deputies, or feared change itself, a self-defense account could be darkened with a single change in tone. While Reeves was undoubtedly effective doesn't only mean good at his work in some broad and comfortable sense. It means he could track people across hard country, make arrests in places where backup was little more than a rumor, and come back alive often enough to do it again. It means he succeeded in a system where failure could be sudden and permanent, where federal officers were dying at a terrifying rate in Indian Territory throughout the era. That's a different order of competence, not just skill, but endurance under sustained threat. Effectiveness is not morally neutral in a racist society. It gets interpreted. Reeves was not only a lawman in a violent region. He was a black lawman exercising federal authority, arresting suspects across racial lines in an age when many Americans, particularly amid the backlash after Reconstruction, expected black people to be controlled, not empowered. The National Park Service's Fort Smith materials explicitly emphasize the uniqueness and the danger of this arrangement. A black deputy under federal authority could arrest white, black, and native suspects. In that setting, even a documented self-defense shooting could be turned by hostile observers into a very different story. Not deputy survives an ambush, but dangerous black man with a badge. Not lawful force, but threat to the social order. Not record of service, but evidence in someone's mind that he must be stopped. That's the irony. The very same event can be read as professionalism or provocation, depending on which conclusion suits the audience of the time. One of the most repeated details about Bass Reeves is that he was illiterate, and yet he carried the job anyway, and carried it well. Reeves is widely described as illiterate, and later accounts say he memorized the contents of warrants and writs. That doesn't just sound impressive. It suggests a highly practical method in a world where paper could be lost, damaged, or taken. Consider what that implies. A warrant isn't a vague, go get that fellow. It is identifiers and precision, names and aliases, charges, the authority of the court, and the details that distinguish the suspect from someone who merely resembles him. It's also practical intelligence, where a person was last seen, who did they run with, and the kind of detail that turns paper authority into an actual capture. If Reeves couldn't read the document himself, then he had to build the whole thing as a mental document, hear it, secure it in memory, and carry it across miles of uncertainty through recall alone. The National Park Service account goes so far as to connect that memorization to operational accuracy, saying it said he never arrested the wrong person because he couldn't read, which was an assertion presented as tradition rather than audited proof, but nonetheless revealing in the way it characterizes his method and reputation. That wasn't just impressive. It was tactical. The frontier did not reward paperwork in the way modern systems do. Paper is fragile. It gets wet. It tears. It burns. It disappears. It can be taken from a man, used to identify him, used to tip someone off about whom he is hunting and why. Even if we treat the security advantage as inference rather than documented strategy, memorization has an obvious practical benefit. Mission-critical details are harder to compromise when they aren't writing in readable form inside a coat pocket. The very habit that compensates for illiteracy may also reduce the chance of losing the plan to weather, theft, or betrayal. Which brings us back to the larger truth. The frontier demanded competence that was practical and portable. Reeves's work didn't live on a dashboard. It lived in what he could carry on a horse, in his head, and through a story ecosystem that could either preserve a fact or turn it into kindling. Later accounts and National Park Service interpretation describe Reeves as using disguises to gather information and make arrests. That single sentence is easy enough to read as frontier color, another flourish in a life already crowded with legend. But in Reeves's world, disguise was not theater. It was counter-surveillance. In Indian Territory, recognition was not neutral. Recognition was a countdown. The moment the wrong person identified you, the target was warned. The town changed temperature. Every friend, cousin, and co-conspirator of the suspect suddenly gained a head start in hiding him, moving him, or deciding what they were prepared to do about you. The danger you faced was not the polished duel of cinema. It was the real frontier version. The ambush you never saw, the rifle shot from cover, the knife in a cramped room, the ordinary gathering that became a mob. That's not melodrama. It's the practical logic of a place where federal enforcement was thin and violence against officers was common. The same National Park Service account that mentions Reeves's disguises also describes Indian Territory as, by 1890, the most dangerous region for federal peace officers in the Old West. In such a setting, being recognized 5 minutes too early could mean the difference between making an arrest and becoming the story others told afterward. Those two traits, memorizing the law and vanishing inside a disguise, belong together. The National Park Service notes that Reeves, illiterate, would memorize his warrants and writs. One practice protects the information a man carries. The other protects the man carrying it. That pairing makes the method feel less like frontier magic and more like tradecraft. A warrant gives authority on paper. It doesn't grant access. Access is the difference between entering a place as a deputy marshal with a target and moving through it as another body the town hasn't yet sorted and named. That mattered all the more when a man was already well known, because notoriety cuts both ways. It can frighten some fugitives into flight, and it can encourage others to gather help. The National Park Service portrays Reeves as a deputy with a formidable reputation, the most feared deputy U.S. Marshal to work the Indian Territory. That sort of reputation is a double-edged instrument. Feared also means watched. Feared means noticed. Feared means people may test you, not merely avoid you. So disguise became a means of reclaiming the one advantage a fugitive usually held: time. It was how a deputy kept the mission from beginning at the moment everyone knew he was coming. It also transformed how information could be gathered. When a community suspected the badge was present, answers became filtered. People had not seen, did not know, could not say. Doors closed. But if a man could enter without triggering that reflex, he might hear what was said when people thought they were not being measured. He might learn who lied by omission. He might map relationships without announcing that he was mapping them. That's why the method mattered. Not because it was clever, though it certainly was. Because it was survival logic in a place that killed deputies. The 1990 Chronicles of Oklahoma article, so often cited for deeper context, is unusually direct about how Reeves's reputation lived inside contradiction. It acknowledges that much had been written and then immediately warns many of the stories are questionable, and notes that there had been considerable debate about his character. That line is significant because it signals something many glossy biographies glide past. Reeves didn't reach later generations as a clean, universally admired legend. He arrived as a contested figure, admired by some, suspected by others, always vulnerable to hostile interpretation. The same article offers a blunt example of how that story war worked. It reports that Reeves killed 14 men during his career and was acquitted in each case because he could prove self-defense in the line of duty, and it adds that Reeves claimed to the end that he had never drawn first in a fight. That's the tragic twist in this part of the story. Restraint. Even if we accept the article's report of his insistence that he did not shoot first, does not guarantee safety from narrative backlash. A courtroom can stamp justified, and public opinion can still decide the number means something else. Now add the layer the National Park Service itself calls a very unique reality. Black deputy United States Marshals in Indian Territory had authority to arrest whites, blacks, or Indians who broke federal law. An arrangement existing under Jim Crow conditions after Reconstruction had ended. That context matters because it helps explain the uglier contradictions in Reeves's reputation. In a racist society, effectiveness is never purely technical. It's interpreted. Some accounts emphasize Reeves as disciplined, competent, respected. Others cast him as feared, selective, too quick to kill, often drawing upon the very rumor and headline ecosystem the National Park Service warns about when it notes that truthful accounts of Reeves's arrests and shootouts were rarely published, and that his role was sometimes omitted or credited elsewhere. This is not a call to canonize him, nor a call to condemn him. It's a call to understand the environment into which his actions entered. When the story afterward is shaped by race, the facts don't merely describe what happened. They become a tool for arguing what someone wants to happen next. A self-defense shooting becomes an accusation. A high arrest count becomes a threat. A disguise becomes sneaky instead of smart, deceptive instead of tactical, untrustworthy instead of legitimate. Once that's understood, the disguise detail stops sounding like a colorful anecdote and begins to read as a professional adaptation to a world in which the danger was not only physical, it was interpretive. Now we reach the story everyone loves to retell because it comes prepackaged like a dime novel. Bass Reeves, an argument, hot grease, a shot, and a body burned in the fire. It's neat, ghastly, and cinematic all at once. If one happened to be a newspaper editor in 1880s Fort Smith, it was the sort of tale that practically wrote itself. The Chronicles of Oklahoma article does something rare in the world of frontier legend. It goes back to the record and shows that the popular version of the incident was a later, widely repeated account. one picked up even by reputable newspapers. When the sensational layers are peeled away, the evidence more strongly supports an accidental shooting. The standard melodrama many remember goes like this. On May 10, 1884, Reeves allegedly killed his cook, usually identified as William Leach, after an argument in camp. The story says the cook threw hot grease on Reeves's favorite dog, and in a fit of rage, Reeves shot the cook, who then fell into the fire. In some accounts, the tale gains an extra dark flourish. Reeves left the body to burn, with some versions going further and saying the body was left charred. It has everything a sensational frontier story could wish for: a simple motive, a shocking image, a clear turn toward violence, and a grim ending. It's the sort of narrative that arrives already wearing stage makeup. The article challenges this neat and terrible version, taking a scalpel to the legend and showing the rough edges beneath. It points out that when one examines the court testimony and records, the picture does not align with the popular version. Instead, it's framed more as a case of accidental shooting than as the act of a man driven to murder. First, the dog. Yes, the dispute involved a dog, but not the melodramatic version in which hot grease is flung in an act of cruelty. In fact, the dog had wandered into camp and was eating from the cooking pan, a small irritation in camp life, not exactly the sort of offense upon which Greek tragedy usually hangs. What emerges is a picture of camp friction, not malice. Reeves threatened to kill the dog, and Leach jokingly replied that if Reeves killed the dog, he would kill Reeves or his gray horse. The exchange is so specific that it feels like a real moment in time, plain, awkward, human, and dusty around the edges. The most crucial difference between the popular version and the record lies in the weapon. The common retelling has Reeves shooting Leach with a pistol, but the research in the article shows something different. A rifle misfired. The article suggests that Reeves was attempting to load his Winchester rifle, intending to shoot the dog, when the rifle discharged accidentally, striking Leach. The evidence suggests not murderous rage, but an accidental shooting in the pressure and confusion of the moment. Even the date proves murky. The arrest warrant lists the date as April 10, 1884, not May 10th, as so often repeated. That discrepancy suggests that later retellings, shaped either by storytelling instinct or simple misremembering, blurred details in order to fit a cleaner narrative. That detail, the date, may seem small, but it's exactly the kind of boring, unglamorous document fact that legend tends to smooth away. Paperwork cares little for dramatic pacing. The warrant doesn't follow the curve of a dime novel. It's flat, factual, and perfectly capable of being inconvenient. But the story doesn't end there, and what follows gives real insight into the man Reeves really was. After the shooting, Reeves couldn't obtain medical attention for Leach until late the next day. Yet the conduct that followed doesn't fit the cold-blooded killer version. It fits the practical response to an accident. Reeves left Leach with a doctor and made arrangements for his medical care, instructing the doctor to send the bill to Reeves when treatment was complete. That was not suspicious or callous behavior. It reads instead like a normal arrangement under brutal circumstances, frontier pragmatism in the face of life and death. That kind of practicality doesn't fit neatly inside the shape of murderer. Instead, it resembles the response of someone stunned by the consequences of an accident and trying to manage the situation as best he could. So the shooting of Leach becomes less the story of a man carried away by rage and more the tragedy of a moment gone wrong, shaped by argument, bad luck, and the harsh realities of frontier life. The popular version of the incident, so often sensationalized for its shock value, was built from local gossip and amplified by the folklore factory that turned real events into gripping narratives. Perhaps good for filling newspapers, selling books, and handing the public a simple story to carry home, but too incomplete and inaccurate for historical records. What remains, in the end, is a far more complicated tale. One that doesn't fit easily into black and white moral frames, but instead asks us to reckon with human error, survival, and practical decision-making in a frontier world. For Bass Reeves, this incident didn't fit the polished frontier hero mold. It was one more episode in a life where danger, professionalism, and hard choices traveled together. After the incident, Reeves returned to Fort Smith and kept working. The Chronicles of Oklahoma article even notes a stretch in which he continued making arrests in the months after the incident with his cook. That fact reveals something often overlooked in sensational stories: time. The accusation against him didn't crystallize immediately. In fact, the article says he wasn't accused of wrongdoing until early 1886, more than a year after the shooting. And there is irony here. Many of the witnesses who later supported the allegation against Reeves had been arrested by Reeves himself. Of course, none of this, Reeves's continued work or the delayed accusation, proves innocence outright. Real life isn't as neat as courtroom theater, and the law isn't always as clear as a verdict form pretends. But the timeline matters. When one presses on sensational stories, they often wobble, because life rarely unfolds like a headline. It doesn't wait obediently for the best dramatic beat. Often, the waiting between events tells a deeper truth than the headline ever could. So, if we are to be as careful as possible, Reeves was charged and tried over the death of his cook. That's the documented core of the controversy, the part that cannot be denied and should not be avoided. The lurid details, such as the hot grease and the body burning in the fire, are the part most often repeated. They're dramatic, cinematic, and difficult to forget. But the article's author, Williams, argues that this version isn't the one best supported by testimony and available records. Instead, the scenario that holds more closely to the facts is the one less thrilling, but more consistent with the kind of tragedy that happens around firearms even now. An accidental discharge of a rifle while it was being loaded or handled in camp. It's a very familiar, very human mistake that can occur even in an environment of routine handling. For Reeves, that tragic accident was documented in a way that aligns with the available evidence, which Williams presents as the version that best fits the record. The headline version is thrilling. A heated argument, hot grease, a shot, a body burned, a dramatic death. It has the clean architecture of a dime novel. A quick hook, a few sharp images, and away it goes. The record version is more complicated. It involves an argument over a dog, a rifle misfire, a delayed effort to get medical attention, and the slow, grinding reality of the frontier. The real version lacks the punch of a polished narrative. However, it carries the texture of life as it's often lived, where things happen abruptly, consequences unfold slowly, and there is no theme music, only the quiet, awful click of a mechanism one believed was under control, followed by the realization that everything has changed. Reeves's personal life, which the Chronicles article also touches, was as complex as his professional one. He married a woman often referred to as Jenny or Nellie Jenny, and together they raised a large family. According to the Chronicles of Oklahoma, he had 10 children, and later in life Reeves remarried. On the surface, it suggests a man who had built a life, a family, and a standing in the world. Then the story circles back to the moment that strips the romance from the West, and it's not a moment anyone tries very hard to romanticize. This is the moment when Reeves, as a lawman, was required to confront a warrant for his own son, Benny Reeves, for a domestic murder. According to sources including the National Park Service and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, Reeves carried through and executed the arrest. His son was convicted and sent to prison. This is where the romance of the West falls away. There's nothing romantic about placing irons on your child, nor is there anything clean or heroic in it. The tension between duty and family, justice and personal loss, is as stark as it can be. When law becomes personal, it's not a movie scene. It's a brutal reality, the kind that leaves marks no ride off into the sunset can erase. In the life of Reeves, this event was far removed from the sweeping pageant of frontier justice. It was not about riding triumphantly into the horizon after catching a fugitive. It was about duty, grief, and the raw, unflinching weight of what law demands when it arrives at one's own door. In that moment, Bass Reeves's role as a lawman becomes painfully clear. The laws of the land didn't bend for him, even when it meant confronting his own flesh and blood. The law may have required an arrest, but humanity demanded something else entirely. And therein lies the terrible line between hero and man, when justice and love pull at the same soul from opposite directions. If there is one scene that explains Bass Reeves, it's not a gunfight. In the classic narratives of the Wild West, the gunfight is the defining moment of a lawman's career, the showdown, the flash of steel, the moral contest staged at noon beneath a wide and pitiless sky. But for Bass Reeves, the scene that best captures his life is marked by no single famous battle. It's found instead in the ride home. The slow, solitary ride after the dust has settled is what sets Reeves apart. It embodies the reality of his experience, the true character of his work as a deputy United States Marshal. It's there, after the shot, after the arrest, after the fugitive is in custody, that the real weight of the work settles upon a man. There the grief, the burden, and the moral complexity of enforcing law under extreme conditions reveal themselves, not in the moment of victory, but in the unrelenting, sometimes soul-crushing persistence of duty. Bass Reeves' service continued well into the early 20th century. The National Park Service tells us that he retired from federal service around the time of Oklahoma statehood in 1907, marking the end of his most famous law enforcement years, which had been spent operating in Indian Territory, a place of extraordinary complexity and risk. After retiring from federal service, Reeves didn't withdraw into quiet obscurity. He continued in public service as a Muskogee City police officer for about 2 more years. That period reveals the depth of his commitment to order, even after decades of hard service on the frontier. But his health forced him to retire once more, this time for good. Reeves died on January 12, 1910, in Muskogee, a city he had both served and seen transformed during his final years. The cause of death is listed as Bright's disease, an old term for kidney diseases, common in the period but imprecise by modern standards. That description must be understood not as a precise diagnosis, but as the label used at the time. Bright's disease could include a range of kidney ailments, and the specifics are difficult to recover now. What is clearer is that by the time he died, his body had been worn down by the toll of decades of dangerous, often grueling service. Reeves's reputation moved in waves. During his lifetime, he was a familiar and formidable figure in the region, with stories about him spreading quickly as people either admired him or feared him. His authority and effectiveness were well known, but his race complicated how those stories were framed. Some praised him. Others viewed his position with hostility. To many, the very fact that a black man could hold such authority was itself a challenge to the social order of the day. After his death, however, his legacy did not continue on a national scale. As the classic Western myth solidified in popular culture, many black lawmen were pushed out of the frame, their stories buried beneath a narrative centered on white cowboys and white lawmen. Reeves became more a regional memory than a household name. For decades, his contributions were largely forgotten, pushed into the footnotes of history, while more storied Western characters like Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid strode across dime novels and Hollywood screens. In recent decades, there has been a marked change in how the country views this turbulent time in its past. State historical organizations and the National Park Service have begun to treat Reeves not as a curiosity, but as a major figure in the history of frontier law enforcement. Public memorials, including the statue of Reeves in Fort Smith, represent this newer recognition, placing him back into the main story of the Old West, not as an afterthought, but as a central figure. Part of that shift in memory has involved a shift in language as well. There has been a distinct move away from the phrase legendary gunslinger and toward recognition of Reeves as a documentable professional operating within a racist and violent system. That change in emphasis is crucial. It removes some of the mythic varnish and offers instead a portrait at once more accurate and more complicated. It acknowledges that Reeves's effectiveness was not only a matter of toughness or his ability to survive gunfights. It was professionalism, his ability to navigate a brutal and hostile environment, and his skill in managing situations where violence was always possible, but rarely the goal. His long service as a lawman, his ability to track suspects across a vast and treacherous landscape, and his willingness to arrest a broad range of suspects, including white criminals, all mark him as an exceptional figure. But his story is not that of a simple, one-dimensional hero. Documentable professional is a less romantic phrase than legendary gunslinger. It is longer, less tidy, not nearly as useful to a poster artist. But it comes closer to the truth. And it is that truth that now asks to be recognized and honored. Then there is the gravitational pull of popular culture, that part of the story where history begins drifting toward Hollywood the way a loose wrench slides toward a magnet. It's almost inevitable. The frontier practically begs to be filmed, and real historical figures like Bass Reeves typically become tangled in that larger-than-life tradition. One comparison, or rather unconfirmed rumor often told about Bass Reeves, was that he was the real-life inspiration for the fictional Western character of the Lone Ranger. It's a marvelous line. Clean, direct, irresistible, and one that resonates with fans of Western culture who might not necessarily be history professors. It has everything popular culture adores. It sounds true. It feels true. The connection seems obvious at first glance. Bass Reeves is a legendary lawman in dangerous country. The Lone Ranger is the quintessential lawman of the American frontier. Both ride into peril, both make dramatic arrests, both face long odds. Unfortunately, the evidence most often offered is not a paper trail. It is more of a feeling, a hope. People point to the thematic parallels: a relentless lawman riding into dangerous country, dramatic arrests against steep odds, the frontier setting, and in some tellings a Native American companion echoing the Lone Ranger Tonto dynamic. Those are compelling parallels, but they're not proof. The frontier was full of similar stories: fugitives running through open country, ambushes in lonely places, and the need for someone willing to ride toward trouble rather than away from it. These are broad themes of frontier law enforcement, not details unique to Reeves. Many figures from the period could be fitted, at least loosely, to the same mold. That does not make them the same person. What we don't reliably possess, at least in the most commonly repeated version of the claim, is what historians cherish most: a direct link. No letter, no interview, no production note, no creator's statement, no contemporaneous account that says plainly, yes, Bass Reeves was the model for the Lone Ranger. Without that sort of evidence, the claim that Reeves was the Lone Ranger belongs in the realm of plausible inspiration or cultural convergence, not settled historical fact. It may be true. It's certainly possible. But it's not proven in the way a serious biography requires. That distinction matters because it protects Reeves's story from drifting too far from fact and documentation into convenient myth-making. It's entirely reasonable to acknowledge that the Lone Ranger story may have drawn inspiration from Reeves. But without solid evidence, the claim must remain speculative, not conclusive. That caution does something useful. It keeps Bass Reeves from being reduced to a fictional icon. His real-life exploits are remarkable enough. He doesn't need to borrow certainty from a character designed to be larger than life. Reeves required no mask, no catchphrase, no triumphant radio theme to become significant. His actual life contained more than enough drama, courage, and complexity. There's always danger when history is swallowed by popular culture. Sometimes it replaces history altogether. Hollywood's version can begin to feel more official simply because it arrives dressed in strong lighting, quick pacing, and a satisfying structure. Without footnotes and citations, such representations often simplify or distort the facts. Popular culture does not just reflect history. It often replaces it. Films, television, and media narratives possess immense power in shaping how the past is remembered, and sometimes they do so by sanding away reality's rougher edges, favoring the marketable version over the nuanced and documented one. In the case of Bass Reeves, the story of him as the real Lone Ranger offers a clear example of that process. While there are thematic similarities, the truth of Reeves is more complicated and in many ways more compelling than a neatly heroic myth. He was a real man operating within a deeply flawed and difficult system, navigating racial, social, and legal challenges every day of his working life. So when one engages with Reeves' story, it's important to separate fact from fiction and honor the man for the hard, dangerous work he did without needing to tie his legacy to a character built for entertainment rather than history. In doing so, one allows Bass Reeves' story to remain every bit as impressive without transforming it into a Hollywood invention. Bass Reeves is important not because he was a superhero in a hat. History has quite enough superheroes, and most of them are suspiciously well lit. Superheroes are creatures of fiction, built to embody idealized strength, courage, and moral certainty. They move through worlds where adversity can be overcome by force or magic, and where the line from struggle to victory is usually clean. Based on those standards, Bass Reeves was not a superhero. He was a real man moving through a world of contradiction, danger, and complexity, working inside a system that often stacked the odds against him. His significance lies not in mythic perfection, but in the authenticity of his life and the persistence with which he navigated systemic racism, legal chaos, and violence. Bass Reeves matters because he shows what competence looks like when the system is stacked against you. His career didn't follow the easy script of sudden fame or anointed heroism. He built his position through local knowledge, linguistic skill, and nerve. Beginning life as a formerly enslaved man, Reeves fashioned a federal career that lasted decades and made him one of the most formidable deputy United States marshals of his time. It's tempting to view such a career through the lens of physical bravery or frontier bravado. However, his real skill lay in surviving and excelling within a harsh environment where the odds were stacked against him, not only because of the dangers of the frontier, but because of the racial and social forces that made his work more perilous at every turn. Reeves didn't simply ride out and arrest criminals. He navigated multiple communities, some with different legal systems, each with its own histories, rules, and biases. In some places, his authority was respected. In others, not so much. TT was questioned or openly resisted. In the face of all that, Reeves relied on knowledge of terrain, command of multiple languages, and natural courage to accomplish what other lawmen, particularly white lawmen, might not have been able to accomplish. His competence was not measured by easy victories, but by his capacity to manage situations where failure meant far more than a missed arrest. It meant danger to life, reputation, and the fragile trust that linked one community to another. Reeves was not just a figure of authority. He was a lawman enforcing warrants across communities that did not share one simple idea of justice. The Old West is often romanticized as a place where justice was straightforward and right prevailed through force of will. But for Reeves, justice was more complicated than that. Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, was a vast and diverse region where federal jurisdiction collided with tribal sovereignty and where different ideas of law lived side by side. To say those communities didn't share a unified vision of justice is to understate the matter. Many of the tribes were living through the aftershocks of forced relocation, the consequences of settler colonialism, and continuing cultural upheaval. At the same time, the federal government was enforcing laws often designed more for assimilation than for equity. In that environment, Reeves had no luxury of applying a single, simple model. He had to adapt constantly, at times serving as a bridge between the federal government and tribal nations, other times navigating the complex relationships between Native American communities and encroaching settler society. His ability to enforce law in such a diverse and turbulent environment reveals the depth of his professional competence. Reeves was, at different times, praised as fearless and damned as dangerous, sometimes by the same society, and sometimes almost in the same breath. That duality is part of what makes his life so important. He wasn't treated as a hero in the ordinary sense. There were no broad parades and very few easy victories. He was often viewed through a lens warped by the prejudices of his time. For a black lawman enforcing federal law in a region full of outlaws, including white criminals, fearlessness was as often read as threat as it was read as virtue. In many cases, Reeves encountered resentment from allies and enemies alike. White society often feared the sight of a black man exercising authority over them, and as a result, many of his actions were judged through a racially charged lens. Even when those actions were lawful, they could be misread or deliberately distorted by those who wanted to see him fail. This was especially true in cases where he had been forced to defend himself against dangerous suspects. A self-defense shooting, in some eyes, could become murder the moment his race entered the story. That ambiguity, admired by some, resented by others, makes him both an important figure and a revealing one. If the story of the Old West is meant to tell us who built order on the frontier, then leaving Bass Reeves out of that story is not simply an omission. It is a distortion and disservice to history. Reeves's life and career embody one of the great contradictions of American history. On the one hand, he was the ideal lawman, courageous, skilled, relentless, and deeply familiar with the land and people among whom he worked. On the other hand, the system within which he labored was deeply flawed, often discriminatory, and regularly dangerous for someone of his race. Even within that system, Reeves excelled, proving not only that he was competent, but that he could thrive under adversity. To leave Reeves out of the narrative is to strip the broader story of the Old West of a crucial truth, that order on the frontier was not built solely by white men in white hats, nor by force alone. It was built, in part, by a man who knew the land, knew the people, knew the law, and knew how to move through complexity without collapsing it into myth. His omission doesn't just lessen his importance. It erases the reality that frontier law was rarely simple. It was an exercise in surviving the intersection of racial, legal, and social boundaries, often without the support of a sympathetic public. The true story of Bass Reeves, a story of resilience, ingenuity, and principled law enforcement, belongs in the larger narrative of the American West, not at the margins, but at the center. Bass Reeves' story ends where myths usually run out of road, with a man who enforced the law even when it broke his heart, riding not toward a stranger, but toward his own family name. That is why he matters. Not as a campfire legend, but as a formerly enslaved man who made the badge mean something in a world that too often refused to make it mean fairness. That's it for this episode of Insights into History. Check back next week when we take a trip back to Roman Britain and a figure that has been inspiring strong women for nearly 2,000 years. If you have feedback, suggestions, or stories you think deserve a deeper look, email me at comments, at insightsintothings.com. Again, that is comments at insightsintothings.com. Or give us a call at 856-403-8788. That is 856-403-8788. Leave a voice message, and we may even include your message in a future show. Again, that number is 856-403-8788. Thanks for listening. We will catch you on the next episode.